Next question that I want to talk about is what happens if one's child is generally well behaved but is not doing well in school? What's the parent to do in terms of figuring out a roadmap on how to proceed? A very important question that needs to be answered in this process is, how do you separate can't from won't? Is it that your child won't work in school, which may be tied to motivation, may be tied to anger at certain educators in the school, may be tied to anger at you, may be tied to um, feeling that the school's not a match for his unique set of skills and abilities and signature strengths? So that would be won't, actually. That's the child who won't. Can't is just like I can't read well without my reading glasses. A child who can't, either because of an undiagnosed language disorder, undiagnosed problems with organization, with an attention deficit, and sometimes you have a child who did fine in school in those early years because he was bright enough to do fine in school. But once everything is kind of amped up with the increased organizational demands of high school, increased demands for abstract thinking in high school, and increased demands for language skills in high school, they fall apart. So it might be helpful, in order to answer that crucial question, which in turn leads to a map for intervention, to have some kind of testing by a learning specialist, a neuropsychologist, a child mental health specialist, to rule out an underlying learning disability or an underlying language problem or organizational deficit. That can be extremely, extremely helpful. Now, next question is one that parents often ask when they're struggling with a difficult adolescent child, and that's, are we to blame? Have we played a role in our son's issues? And there, the answer is that one has to understand that to the extent that parents get into a blame game with themselves and blame themselves for their child's problems, it almost always leads to a counterproductive escalation of the emotionalism in the situation. As soon as there's a feeling of guilt about the way the child's acting, accurate or not, we'll address accuracy in a minute, but there tends to, at that time, be higher levels of expressed emotion, such as yelling, screaming, criticism, which we know almost always exacerbates child's behavioral and emotional difficulties. It almost always leads to a non-productive approach to helping the child deal with his problems instead of a collaborative kind of standing by his side. In fact, what leads to a serious problem on the part of the child is often a complex array of biological issues, of temperament, of schooling history, of sibling rank, and at times of parenting. But that's fine. If you're lucky enough for a big part of it to be tied to parenting, that's great, because you could change that. You could work on it. If it's issues that are not necessarily in your control, then self-blame is just not accurate and not terribly productive. So again, a competent mental health professional who's standing at your side, helping you figure this all out, could be extremely, extremely helpful. And the last issue I'm going to talk about is, if your child's in Israel, what's the best way to communicate and relate to your child while he's in Israel? It's interesting. We did some research here looking at about 600 kids in the course of all kinds of variables in terms of what was associated with a successful time in Israel and not. Turns out that regular communication with parents was actually helpful, because the better the connection with your parent, the better your child will do. But there is a limit. We found that parents who visited too often, it was often associated with not such good outcomes. And you have to find the balance between being there for your child, but also giving him enough emotional space to make it on his own. I can't give you a set number, but to be in touch with your child a couple of times a week via phone or other modes of connection is great. But to be in touch with your child constantly, several times a day, as is often the norm nowadays, probably does get away from being there with them. I once heard Rabbi Shmuel Kamenetsky say in the early days of the cell phone, he didn't allow cell phones in the Philadelphia yeshiva because he said if you have a cell phone and you're a student in the Philadelphia yeshiva, once you have that cell phone, you're not, literally not in the Philadelphia yeshiva because your mind is elsewhere. So you want to find a balance that takes that reality into account. But the bottom line is to keep in mind that as long as you're at your child's side, as long as he knows that you believe in him, and as long as he knows that he could turn to you and that no matter what happens, you'll never stop holding his hand, ultimately the norm is resilience. Thank you.